You and I are going to have to sit down and have a discussion. You know, one of the things we're doing now is let me know with the camera here. The way I'm running this campaign is, basically our slogan is transparency, integrity, and accountability. What we're doing is everything that everybody that I talk to, or every event that I go to, we're filming, and then we're putting the information right out on the internet right away, which is live from here to get it. And one of the reasons that we're doing this is because, the way the information is getting out on the internet, the Islamic world, as a Muslim candidate, is looking at this.
Really?
So it's real important for us, to present ourselves not only well as Muslims, but as an American.
But who is we? I mean, are you actually semi-organized? Do you talk to each other?
There's a couple people I know. I have my best contact, and you were talking about watching the documentary. I did a documentary in Syria in 2004. It was about the Sheikh Ahmed Qatar, and so I know his organization well. I know his son who took over for him at the foundation. I have fairly regular contact with them indirectly, and that organization is really well connected in terms of both talking to people, not only the Syrian government, but also with at Sheikh Qatar's funeral, Khaled Meshal was there. So I mean, it's a good opportunity to talk to people and want to work with them. But yeah, in general, I'm really happy with most of what you said.
Well, it's interesting. Your dispute with me ties back to things I've read so much about, and maybe I'm horrified about what I read.
You're talking about the website. I know the website.
No, I don't even go to that.
Well, you have to. One of the problems with Muslims, a lot of Muslims, like you said, they think Islam is one way and that's it. But on the flip side, there's been a lot of really solid scholarly research that's been done.
I know that too.
And the Islamic narrative
is disputed as scholarly research will be, because it's
the general consensus. I mean, it's a matter of nuance on the narrative that came out of Islamic history from the Islamic world. What you were talking about, the slaughter of the Jews, it didn't. The beheadings actually happened. There's no question about that. But the circumstances leading up to that were a lot different. The circumstances were that when Muhammad went to Medina, they formed the Medina family,
right,
which was all the tribes in the area, and then they were attacked by Mecca, and that was the battle of Trench.
Yes.
The battle of Trench.
Yes.
Yeah, and after the battle, during that battle, the Jewish tribe, which was one of three tribes in Medina, betrayed Muhammad to the Meccans, and then it was a matter of what do we do? We have this tribe that's living among us, which betrayed us. How do we deal with it? So it wasn't as clear cut as they marched in there, took over the city, and then chopped everyone's heads off. I mean, they had been living and working together for quite a while before that tribe betrayed the rest of the Meccans.
I think you got my attention on that, because that is, and by the way, I knew it's probably unfair to grab that up. I'm normally talking to audiences. What I'm trying to point out is that, and you can dispute this with me, that certainly Christianity was spread by the sword in many ways. I have to say this, Judaism is not.
They don't mention it.
Yeah.
Most of the history they haven't.
Yeah.
Although you can go back to the early, the pre-Christian era.
Yeah, but I mean today you don't have a lot of Jews trying to convert.
Oh, right.
Whereas you still have Christian factions that believe, unless you accept Jesus Christ and say you're not going to heaven, so you're almost an infidel. They don't. With exceptions of things like the KKK, a guy knocking down a building in the guy in Oklahoma City really wasn't that a religious fanatic, he was an anti-government fanatic. But I mean, the cases are isolated and manageable because we've gotten to where we can speak out against that kind of violence that Jews and Christians make. What bothers me is, and the question came up, the lack of a global voice. Instead of talking against American foreign policy, I'd like to hear some voice, maybe 5% or 10%, speak against violence and against some of the mistreatment of women. I understand fully the women's issues.
That is a rampant issue too. There's no question about that. That's a cultural problem.
That's much more complicated than most people will give. But the other thing is, I would like to hear more voices. You don't hear Mubarak. Mubarak's what, 4 or 5 assassinations. I know him personally. He's not a very bright. He is who he is, but he's not going to speak out against this. I was surprised that the King of Jordan backed off, but again, he's got some terrorists living there. You know?
Well, the problem with these guys are exactly the problem, because what's happened. And this isn't just a question of U.S. policy. This is a question of policy in that part of the world.
Yes, I agree.
Going way back. But we
heavily oil. Israel's a total subject.
Yeah, those two issues. I think that's the crux of our foreign policy issues, foreign policy problems. But what we have is dictators and their entire power structure revolves around keeping them. And so when secular voices come up in that part of the world, they're crushed because they're seen as a threat to the existence.
But they're really talking democracy,
right?
When they say,
or
representative government, right? Democracy is the wrong word. But that's
the only place where people can with a minimal government interference is the mosque. And what happens, particularly with the Wahhabis, I mean, the Wahhabis, you go back to the revolution in '79. That really empowered Islam. But I mean, for the most part, we've had a problem with the Sunni extremists.
And was he talking about the Shia and the Wahhabis? I didn't understand that. I would call Saudi Arabia a Sunni nation.
Yeah, he was wrong about that. Yeah.
All right, I didn't want to debate that. That didn't make sense. Was he trying to say the Wahhabis were different from Sunnis, or?
I think he was comparing the number of Sunnis. The number of Shiites is about 20%.
Yeah. How about Bahrain?
Bahrain, I think, actually does have a majority.
But they're integrated very, very well. And Yemen. I don't know about Yemen.
Yeah, Yemen is close to Bahrain.
Bahrain, they have such a small population anyway.
The royal families are all Sunni.
But I thought he was totally wrong on Saudi Arabia. That's the only question I got wrong, by the way.
Yeah.
What is he talking about?
Yeah, it's about 20%. But
I think he read a book and read something about Wahhabis and sort of put them in a separate category. But the Sunnis, the Sunni radical fundamentalists.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, obviously 9/11. I mean, and that problem goes back. I mean, if you look at the way when they started organizing, it was after 67. Well, really, you go back to Black September.
You actually go back to Black September.
Black September is when that really started.
But don't you trace the ideology or teachings of Hutub?
Oh, absolutely. But it's a perverse,
and there was one before him in the 20s.
Yeah, still. Ibn Wahab, yeah.
Yeah, Wahab.
Yeah.
But Hutub is the one that really spread some education.
Well, what happened is they were powerful within the Saudi family. They were powerful within the Jebi era, and then they gained power.
And Yemenis.
Yeah.
But more the Wahhabi, the Saudi Wahhabis.
Yeah. Well, that ideology spread as a direct consequence of oil, because what happened is after World War I, we decided not to back the Hashemites, we backed the Saudis. And then they brought with them that ideology, and with the oil money, they were then able to spread that. And they were the only ones that were funding Islamic education around the world and the Muslim world.
And they did, and their texts were fundamental as early Christian texts.
Right.
I mean, obviously the Christian missionaries didn't talk about a progressive form of Christianity.
Well, it's interesting. There is a really broad consensus within the Muslim world outside of Saudi Arabia that the Saudis, their version of Islam is inherently corrupt. I mean, if you go to like Al-Azhar in Egypt, or Lebanon, Syria, the scholars
and the majority of Pakistan.
Oh, Pakistan's a touchy issue because the big issue in Pakistan isn't religion so much as it is it's tribal. It's the issue between the
people choose that as religion. It's not.
Yeah, and the Punjabi and the Bluthers. Yeah. That's the main issue there. And then with the Pashtuns,
as it was in Afghanistan also.
Right.
People confused because Bin Laden took up. But that wasn't what Afghanistan was about when the Russians. It wasn't a Muslim issue.
Right. Well, what happened, and again, Afghanistan's a perfect example of how misguided foreign policy can affect it, because that's basically, you look at the organizational foundation of Al Qaeda. You have the Saudi and the Pakistani alliance.
And then you get the Egyptians coming in.
Right. that organization came together. It was directed by us.
Well, also helped by Mubarak, who since he passed out of jail because they didn't want to deal with them.
Right, exactly. And that's what all these guys do. Is I mean, they either kick them out of the country or.
But then again, I sometimes I joke. We're 230 years old here. We don't have it right yet. Democracy is tough. I mean, just look at what I was saying in our presidential debate. You said you want to export this, but who was it? Was it Churchill said the most god-awful thing we've ever seen? Democracy is better than most of the alternatives. We don't know the answers, but as the human race evolves and becomes more modern, people want or should have a voice. Now, in some cultures, people don't want a voice, but as long as they say to themselves, it's fine. It's when it gets carried global, I worry so much about the internet, both, by the way, for the things that feed anti-Muslim and for what some of the extremists are saying on that. They got about 5,000 sites now. The internet is a very dangerous tool because people read it and assume it's correct. But what I want to see is the discourse on this. So maybe I go a little extreme to try and wake people up. I think it's totally wrong. I'm not talking about Iraq or military going in. It's totally wrong not to have a discourse on this. Just as it was wrong, the analogy I'm drawing on 1938, it was wrong for the world not to talk about the dangers of fascism. And look what happened. I mean, I think, some people argue it's pushing 100 million people died in an 8 or 10 year period. It was pretty bad. Right. And the weapons today are much, much worse. If Hitler had the A-bomb there, would he have used it? Probably.
And that's
they dropped it on London.
That's one of the biggest issues we face. I mean, with all the advances in technology and culture, we've gotten to a point where an individual's power to create something positive is 100-fold, but with that power to create comes that power to destroy. So
that's why benevolent dictators don't work. They have tremendous
exactly.
power, but they don't stay benevolent very long.
Exactly. So we've got to engage this issue on a more human level, because if we look at this in terms of nations versus an ideology, or we're going to lose. We have to be able to get out on the street and talk to people. I tell you one of the most interesting things, when I went to Syria, I was there in 2004, late 2004. Even after the invasion of Iraq, Syrians were furious about the invasion. They're always, they've been in a state of constant alienation about Israel. But when you talk to them about their ideas of America, they have almost this touchingly naive image in their head of what democracy means and what a land of opportunity means, and that faith is there, and that's what we've got to capitalize on. And the problem is when we go and we back these dictators, and again, especially in the Arab market, it all comes back to Israel. That is in their mind.
I don't know what to do about Israel. I don't know a clue.
It's a much easier situation to solve than it's given credit for. Because, think about, of all the problems that we have with the Muslim world, this is the one issue where we have clearly defined borders, and we have a reasonable agreement that's been put forth, or the possibility of a reasonable agreement that's been put forth on both sides of the Arab League plan. Most sensible people, and I've talked to people, like I said, who are involved in Hezbollah. Most sensible people in those organizations are willing to accept the existence of Israel if they can get a real viable Palestinian state, if they can get those 57 borders, something reasonably close to those established. Of course, you have your radicals.
And how about Jerusalem?
Jerusalem, this is a touchy issue. I think one of the best things that I've seen on the issue of Jerusalem is declare joint sovereignty.
Is that what they're talking about in Annapolis? Is basically, or something in that
Annapolis
direction?
is a waste of time.
Really?
Annapolis, I think, is basically just the Bush administration trying to rally support against Iran. And this is the way the Arab world in particular sees this. When Bush was over there, in some of the most pro-government states.
The only reason I argue it's not a waste of time is, to me, any kind of discussion is better than zero. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well,
unless it's a false.
But you have to, exactly. Mahmoud Abbas right now, he has zero credibility with the Palestinian people because he's been in power over 2 years. He hasn't got one checkpoint. Exactly. And every time you set up a major event,
Netanyahu waiting in the wings. This guy's right wing.
This is one of the biggest problems we have is the right wing has got such a stranglehold on Israeli politics.
Well, the problem with Israel is there's no center. There's a right and a left. The center it's really two bumps almost rather than the Gaussian curve.
And what you see in Israel is it's something that we're in danger of heading in that direction ourselves, because you don't when you have the politics of fear in the mix, it keeps people too terrified to really sit down and to talk about things. It makes people too afraid to look at rational solutions, because there's always this fear in their head that around the next corner someone's going to blow me up. So they tend to look towards those extreme solutions. They tend to tune out the moderate voices, because the moderate voices are always there. When you were talking about the reaction on 9/11, there was a lot of really profound negative reactions.
It wasn't global, or it didn't get global. I know that. I'm saying, but you need people like now. Some of the voices, the Muslim voices, have their own agendas and so forth. They speak up. That's all right. And actually, like the woman who speaks, or the one that came from Africa into Europe. What's her name? Genital surgeon.
Yeah.
She's a damaged person, a hurt person, so she speaks with a passion, and she links into the women in the audience, what they're doing. So I'm not sure she's doing any good at all. They call her a voice of moderation, but she's really not. She's got an agenda. She's not that articulate either. That's not what we need. That's not what we need. We need people like you, and what I like about the way you're doing is you're balancing. You're not rejecting out of hand that there's a problem, because that's a mistake. There is a problem. I'm sure you agree with some of what I said. There's too many young Muslims being taught by radicals.
And those camps are terrifying. There's no question about it. There was a documentary that was done here in the U.S. I think was it called Jesus Camp? What was it? Yeah, and it was a very similar program to documentation. But the big difference between, I think, fundamentalist Christians in the U.S. and fundamentalist Muslims in the Middle East is here in the U.S. fundamentalist Christians understand that they have a voice in the process, and they feel that they have a voice in the process. They're less likely to resort to radical terrorism, radical means. I don't think it's necessarily anything that's inherent to Christianity or Islam, but when people feel like their backs against the wall, that's when they really
but let me put a different spin on this. The reason why fundamentalist Christians are not the threat that fundamental Muslims are is there's too many voices of Christianity that speak aggressively against them, and they have the stage against them. There's nobody in the political theater in the modern Western world that will get elected based on violence against people because of their faith. So what I don't see the equivalent in the Muslim world. Maybe you do, but I've spent a lot of time in Indonesia and Pakistan and Afghanistan. I've been all, and I think there is fear of speaking out, and also privacy, I call it, respecting religion, more so than the Christian, maybe more equivalent to the Mormons, as I said. Mormons don't talk about what's going on. We do know that paradise is in Missouri, but it's not going to know. But
it's a closed culture, and again,
that's a better way. Yeah,
that's a real problem.
And they don't want anybody looking in the culture. And then when we put out Hollywood films that offend me and my grandchildren, that's films you can't watch a show on TV tonight that would offend a really religious Muslim or a religious Christian, right? So what they see is what we export, which is borderline disgusting in some cases, but certainly it's not what America really is, although sometimes I think that's what America is becoming. So if I were out there in a good family in Pakistan, I would look and say, I don't want that for my grandchildren. If that's what democracy is, I don't want it. Forget the military side of it. If it's that kind of culture, if freedom, the problem with freedom is you're free or you're not free. And freedom is constantly stretched and tested and abused. And I had long talks with Mubarak about this, because we were talking about freedom of press and we were trying to naively make an impact there. And it was during the time of Monica Lewinsky. And Mubarak, have you met him? He's loved. What else would you think about him? This guy is fun, he's charismatic, he's not highly educated, he's a regular Joe, Made it to the head of the Air Force somehow, I don't know how. But, he said, it was during the time of Monica Lewinsky. See what they do with the Clinton over this. And he used some very foul language and all. He said, the skeletons I got. He said, the problem, and this was really registered, he said, the problem, he said, here I am, I'm trying to run a country with 50 or 60 million illiterate people, and he said, if they see a press, when they see your press say things, they assume the government's saying that. They can't understand a free press. It just doesn't translate. So he said, if I allow the media in Egypt to criticize me, my sons, my family, I would be finished. I would be, oh my God, and it would never having that freedom, it would go like this. It would go completely out of control, as it's out of control in this country right now. So the problem with freedom is you can't, in a binary fashion, grant it. You can't move from a benevolent dictator or oppression. That's what's happening in Iraq. How do you then transform? We've been 230 years trying to get it right. I think sometimes we're further than we were back in the days far over. It's not easy.
And that's the thing, it's not that we have to get, like you said, we have to get it out of our head that there's a solution in a year or 2 years. We have to understand that it's a gradual process. There are definite starting points from where we're at now that will move this thing forward. I think the most important thing in terms of the Arab world is the Israeli-Palestinian issue, because one of the things that those dictators...
Now, you agree, though, you take that out of the equation, we still got a problem, right?
Oh, yeah.
Right. But I agree.
The problem becomes...
that becomes a rallying
more manageable.
point. Very much more manageable.
Yeah. We'll go 99.9% more manageable, because what happens, the dictators in that part of the world, they club their people over the head with the threat of Israel, that Israel is out to get you. That's their boogeyman, and what happens is if we create a situation where there is a just settlement for the Palestinians, and that includes recognizing Israel's right to exist, and the rest of the Arab world recognizing Israel, then suddenly the boogeyman that they've been using as a club over their people is gone, and it makes it much easier to start to institute these gradual reforms.
But it's easier said than done. You have Israel, let's call it a heavily armed nuclear nation. Nobody knows, nobody wants to talk about it. Maybe I know more than I should, but it's how do you allow Israel to exist as a state, knowing that if you do have a dispute, they can blow you off the face of the earth. This is so complicated.
And this is one of the things that we're behind, that we're not understanding in terms of our strategy. Ahmadinejad got misquoted.
Yeah, I know that, but he is a nutcase.
He is. Well,
that's the wrong word. That's the wrong word. He's not a nutcase.
Well, he's out in 2009 anyhow. I guarantee.
And I'm interested in is he speaking for the superiors, or are they allowing him, or is he out of control? Or
I think he's a little bit out of control, because it seems like they're not crazy. But
he's not highly educated.
No. And what he said, is he didn't say wipe out the face of the map. He said fade from the pages of history. And that distinction is
Does he believe in Armageddon?
I'm sure he does, as a Shiite, as a devout Shiite, I'm sure he does. But of course, the Muslim version of Armageddon is much different.
Than the Hollywood version?
Yeah. But when he was misquoted, that it gets to the heart of the misunderstanding. And the strategy of the most extreme factions that are involved in the Israeli conflict is not to defeat Israel militarily. What they've come to recognize is that if the Jewish state, that is a state that is run by a majority of Jewish people.
It's not a religious state, but it's a Jewish state.
Yes.
It's culturally.
If they can get to the circumstances where the Israelis are forced to recognize the Palestinians as citizens of that state, what happens to the Jewish majority? It ceases to exist.
Right, overnight.
And that's their strategy. Their strategy is not to defeat Israel militarily. Their strategy is to keep pushing Israel to the point where there's no settlement possible, there's no two-state settlement possible, and 20, 30 years down the road, everyone says it's an apartheid state, we're sick of it, everybody's a citizen.
So they breed.
The Jewish state,
but they have, their population goes...
And the Jewish state fades from the pages of history. He didn't say Israel will be wiped off the map, he said the Jewish state
I know that. I know that.
And,
I lived in Iran. I believe we made... I'm not a Jimmy Carter fan. I think we made really fundamental mistakes back then, because there was no. I go back to that time period because, and I'm not saying that something wouldn't have happened, maybe in some worse, who knows? But that allowing a very small number of radicals, when you really put it in perspective the size of the state of Iran, to throw over a government without a single weapon, and without a 9/11, by the way, for that matter. I think they burned a movie theater or two. But I mean, that just became a model, even though they're Shia. Even I told Khomeini spoke about God. You know, they understood the common my cousin and I against the infidel type thing. You know, and we should never allow it. But all this, I have a struggle with, and I hear you, but you know, like most people, I'm immediately asking the question about 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, 6 years ago. Somehow we have to accept in a corporation, we don't come in and say, how did this happen? We kind of want to learn for lessons learned, but we don't want to focus 90% of our energy back on the past, maybe 5%, maybe fire a few people. But we have to accept Israel exists. Now, quite frankly, I wish it didn't exist. That's you can't undo 50 years of history, right? So, and you can't undo the fact that Israel grew up. So you got to say, as a businessman, you sit there and say, what are we dealing with here? Oh my God, this is big. But going backwards doesn't help a lot.
The fundamental years, the crux of the conflict now, the way that it's framed, even with the radical opposition, it's not 48, it's 67.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to 48.
Yeah, it's 67.
Because that's where the borders are.
For the most part, the question of Israeli existence
and what is called occupation,
it's you know, they're holding out on recognizing Israel because that's one of the biggest trump cards. You know, that's one of the biggest cards they have in negotiations.
I agree.
And I think it's unreasonable to ask them to recognize Israel then negotiate. That's what you get from the result of negotiations. You get that final recognition. I mean, when in history of diplomacy has
Jack, thanks for coming.
Thank you for inviting me.
Mike, when you get a chance, just talk to Gary from DC. Nice to meet you. Good luck when you're going to.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks. And Ron, let's stay in touch by email.
Yes, please.
All right.
What was that?
About 67.
About 67, right. It's you know, it's that's the main issue for these guys, and that's what they're
You
bringing
don't.
around.
If you hold off recognizing them, because that's your only trump card. But do they consciously, when they do silly things like I call it silly lob and rockets, do they believe that helps their cause? It doesn't help them in the West, of course, because it gives Israel ammunition that these people are trying to kill innocent civilians, you know?
The biggest problem with the radical side that we fail to understand, they thrive on conditions of chaos, violence, and ignorance. That's where they get strong. The more extreme the conditions are, the more that they will thrive.
Throughout history, not just
that's always the case with extremists. And you can talk about going back
you don't want full education,
right? But you know, when people are afraid, when people are hungry, when people are you know, when I was talking to a Palestinian friend of mine who was saying, you know, his cousin, she's going to university in Ramallah, and it takes her 3 hours to get through the Israeli checkpoints, to go to class, and then 3 hours to get home. So he was saying, you know,
we live in North Palestine.
Yeah, he was saying, you know, when you talk to somebody who's a Palestinian who says they have a degree, you need to respect that because they went through a heck of a lot just to get to school. But you know, when we create conditions like that, that makes, you know, education that much more difficult. When we attack a country like Iraq, and you know, you're right, we're there now. There's nothing we can do about it, but we can certainly stop them doing anything too idiotic with Iran at this point.
Oh, I don't think they will, but I'm more worried about Israel doing something with Iran.
Yeah, well, you know, either way, it reflects.
It doesn't really matter. No, it doesn't mean you're exact. It really doesn't matter.
Yeah,
exactly right.
Because I mean, in the eyes of that part of the world.
I mean, I live there, and I know the very sizable number of educated Iranians in Tehran. But as a percentage of the population, that doesn't matter. There are, I mean, literally millions here in this country that you know, reject whatever's going on, and got out because, and grew families here because they rejected the radicalism of Khomeini. And that's not to say the Shah was anything but perfect. He wasn't. And that's why you get to your point about dictators. When you get a Shah in there, or you get a Musharraf in there, I don't know what you do. Maybe you just stay out. What do you do? You can't. When I heard a politician last week say, if I was president, I'd go in and tell Musharraf to step down and get him out of there. I mean, that's not the answer either. No, it's just not. The same with the Shah. Now, there were people in the diplomatic corps, in the government, I don't want to go to Jimmy Carter, who talked to the Shah about a parliament and a process, let's say, of representative government. he was concerned that his son, still alive, may still play a role in the world, who knows. He was not the intellect, let's say, to handle the challenges of Iran. So he really wasn't trying to pass the baton on to his son, and he knew he was dying of cancer. So at least there was. I mean, I wouldn't have thrown him out. I would have just kicked him a little bit further to try,
Well, the problem with the Shah was that he was installed over a Democratic government in the first place.
And you can't. I know. But absolutely. But that government had thrown out the Ayatollahs and had separated church and state, which was unconscionable, right? But yeah, then there was an overthrow, and the CIA handled all that and so forth. And the Shah was 16 years old when they brought them up.
And talking about what we can do in the future, that's the first thing. Is we need to get out of black ops business.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. I understand. I was an intelligence officer for 5 years. I understand.
You're a convert to Islam?
I wouldn't say convert because I was never fully a Christian. My family was Catholic. I was baptized, but I never took communion.
I was Catholic too.
Yeah. So I didn't grow up in the Muslim faith. We need to get out of the black ops business.
Don't we have to legitimately worry about WMD?
Oh, sure, it's a threat.
I know more about what they did. Their writings on Ebola. I mean, that scares the hell out of me. I don't care if there's 100 of them. Ebola is something you don't want to mess with.
These and the radicals definitely want that stuff.
Oh, yeah.
But it's a question of results, and that's the issue. And the black ops have always created more problems than they solve. So that's number one. We got to get out of
Well,
it.
in nutcases, I know some. They're not normal people.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
They're fanatics themselves.
So we need to get out of that. Number two, we need to, in a situation like Iraq and the Israel and the Palestinian situation, we need to do everything we can. We are directly involved to resolve it to our standards, to how people in America would want to be treated. This is the problem with the United States. If we treated the rest of the world like we treat ourselves, like the Americans treat each other, we would have no problems. But we have two different standards. We have a standard for how Americans are treated and what's American justice and what we consider to be justice around the world.
I agree with that completely.
And if we can firmly commit ourselves to the principle.
The answers are always simplistic. That's a very simplistic, beautiful, they say elegance and simplicity. We just treat others like we treat ourselves, which is a Christian virtue as well as a Muslim or anybody. We'll be fine.
And that's really what it comes down to. The issue of hypocrisy. When I travel, even when I talk to Muslims here in the U.S., we talk about this. Hypocrisy. That's the number one issue.
Of course, people making the decision are not evil people. They don't think of themselves as hypocrites. They think of themselves, including the black ops people, they're low radical. They have inordinate power because they're operating in America. And because I lived in Iran and throughout the world, you get a little snippet of information, all of a sudden it gets faster. It happened there during the Iran Revolution. So I understand that process of peace, and if you're in that business, the only thing you got to sell to your superiors is that you got a piece of information nobody else has. So you don't fabricate it before you grab them.
When I was an analyst, people used to ask me what I did. I said I was professionally paranoid. I talked to one of my good friends here. He's like Syrian, and he's a great guy. I mean, he's got a very open mind perspective on things. But he grew up in Syria, and he has that paranoid mindset. Because when you grow up in Syria, the government really is out to get you. And the government is always lying to you, no question about it. And so they bring that mindset over here with them. And you made a good point when you were talking about, not only are the Muslims in this country well educated, but they're well integrated into the culture. And that's the most
That's not the case in some places in Europe.
No.
South of Paris and some in Belgium, it's a little frightening.
Because they have those ghettos there, because they put this
There's some racism by the French, so they don't want to admit that, but they don't want to admit that.
My brother-in-law is French, and my sister lives in Provence, and she says
it's a dangerous situation.
Yeah, and it was created because London's a perfect example. They brought over.
I lived in London 5 years.
They brought over all those Pakistanis as cheap labor, and then the textile industry went belly up, and so
now all of a sudden you got unemployed people you brought in. You created a ghetto.
Yep.
You don't know how to.
And there's no way for them to get out of it, and that's why I think there is, of course, I would never say that there's no danger of radicals seeping into the American Muslim community, but the possibility of that happening here is much lower than it
Well,
is
the reason
in
I, to me, I happen to believe in secure borders, period. Although I'm anything but an isolationist, but I mean, I believe in immigration, but I believe it has to be legal. So I bring that up to point that there's more to this story than just the Latinos. And there were 19, educated Muslims in here who they had a mission. And part of that problem with the Muhammad Atas of the world is they're educated, but they have no purpose in life. No. I deal with so many young Egyptians in my role in Abid East. And when I was chairman of the President's Council, they get their education, they go back there, and it's a corrupt society. They can't, and they're working for a guy whose intellect is about 50 points lower than theirs, and he doesn't know what he's doing, and they just give up and they leave. So that you have this drain of some of the better people in the Muslim countries that wind up wherever they can. It's so serious. And
I tell people, if they want to understand what their government's operating like in that country, watch The Sopranos. Because
you're right.
It really is. I mean, it's based on family, it's based on loyalty. There's the issue of capability and capacity rarely comes up, and they will resolve any issues with violence and drop of a hat.
I don't want to go to specific countries because I've seen sons put in positions that is ridiculous. If you ever ran corporate America that way, it used to be run that way, but if you ever ran corporate America that way, it would collapse. You have to have ability to get into a leadership role. You can't just be politics. You can't just go there because you last name. So, I really wish you well. Now, what are you running for, and what does it have to do with you being a Muslim, though?
I'm running for Congress.
Yeah, but is it very secondary you being a Muslim, or are you going to?
The issue of being a Muslim is secondary, but of course you know how the press works in this country.
So it's going to be an issue. We'll give you more airtime anyway.
Yeah, exactly. It's going to come up.
Don't sign on the Quran, please. Don't put your hand on the Quran. Can you put your hand on the Bible when you sign in? Or
you know what I was thinking of doing is doing the Bible and the Quran together.
Oh, that would give a different message. That's interesting.
That's what I'd like to do. In fact, what I'd love to do is I would love to get an actual copy of the Torah, a copy of the New Testament, and a copy
now,
of
if you put the Torah in as well, then I would really, you could make a statement, you could get national press over that, and that is so fundamental. But can I ask you one more thing? Don't say what the other congressman did, that Jefferson got his Quran because he had such respect for the Islamic religion. That's not why he got his copy. It's historical. He was concerned about the Barbary pirates, didn't understand them, and who knows what copy he read, because translations aren't as perfect, but whatever. That's an interesting idea. I like that idea a lot.
Jefferson, he's talking about a guy who made his own version of the Bible, so respect for religion wasn't exactly in his character to begin with.
It's amazing how history can be rewritten. Yeah. Well, Abraham Lincoln was one of the most hated presidents more than George W. Bush. Oh my God, what they said about him. It is amazing, isn't it, history? But that's a very intriguing idea, especially if you could, in the process, use the bully pulpit to articulate that we are a nation where religion is a matter of choice, and that's what makes us what we are. We have to get out of this stuff about, this is a Christian nation. Yeah, but I don't care if 80% of them are Christian, doesn't matter. That's exactly what the founding fathers wanted. They didn't want a state-run religion.
And it corrupts, not only does it corrupt the state, it corrupts the religions as well.
Yeah, it does.
A religion is best when it's taking care of people on a human level and on an individual level. Yeah, but when they get involved in matters of state, when they get in matters of politics, then the focus tends to shift from what you can do for your personal salvation to what we can do to stay in power, what we can do to get in power. And this is the problem. Obviously, this is the problem in the Islamic world, and I think we also see it here with the fundamentalists in this country as well.
Fundamentalist population is large.
Yes. In this district in particular, there's a fairly sizable, I couldn't give you a percentage. I don't think they're a majority by any stretch of the imagination, but there's a fairly sizable.
Do you see Romney's getting a surprising, polls getting a surprising evangelical vote? I think they're going to reject him out of hand. Well, Dr. Dobson has not endorsed or supported him, but he's made some fairly positive statements. I think he's looking at Romney versus Giuliani. If I got a choice, I could go to Romney. I don't know. But it's interesting that a Mormon can get that. Now, a Muslim's going to have a hard time. You know that.
one of the things that, that when I talk to religious people, one of the things that I came to appreciate about Islam is that, and this may be by virtue of its time in history when it came about, but you can go
I know
back.
that. Everybody was beheading and slaughtering people. I know that.
Well, that's actually what I was going to get to was that the Prophet Muhammad recognized Christianity, recognized Judaism. Basically,
in the early days.
True? No,
I thought if you read the progression, now the Quran has no context or history, it's more a bunch of, but I'm talking about the Hadith.
Well, the problem with the Hadiths, though, the Hadiths I have a big problem with the Hadiths.
Just like some of the stories about Jesus Christ.
Right, because the Hadiths were gathered about 90 years after the Prophet died, and they were gathered under the auspices of the Umayyad government after the government had moved from Mecca to Damascus. And there was a lot of politics involved in the way that they were collected. So.
And see, I get some of my beliefs from the Hadiths rather than the Quran, because the Quran has no historical context. You can't.
Well, you have to get that's when you read the Quran, you can't read it straight through like a canon narrative. You have to understand the context of everything.
Exactly. That's what I meant when I said no context. It's not a
within the text itself. Yeah, there's no
within the text itself. Right. Yeah. Plus, I'm reading an English version, which I think is illegal anyway. Right?
But yeah, within the Muslim community, this is the problem with those extremists.
I know.
They put more weight on the Hadith than they do on the actual.
And they pick just as fundamental Christians have done over the years. But there's unfortunately this is a more modern religion. There's more written. Some of it has to be what I use the word moderate. I hate the word moderate Muslim. I use it because people use it, but everybody thinks they're moderate. I think I'm moderate. You think you're moderate. In a sense.
Right.
We don't think we think of ourselves not as extreme as therefore we must be moderate. So the word is real modernization and integration and accepting some basic tenets of the 21st century that really are not Christian or Jewish or Muslim.
And it's not just the 21st century, no. You talk about freedoms and democracy and everything. There are, you can look at the early Islamic government, the first couple of caliphs. You can look at the way that the Prophet Muhammad ran things, and there is context within Islam itself for these innovations, for these for these changes.
There are?
Yeah. In fact, when you show that documentary, I shot it. But I'll make you a deal. I'll come to that one. You're gonna have to watch my documentary.
I'll show you the documentary. I'm not. And a question is
it might be to compare the two.